Welcome to the ClearPoint Unlock podcast. I'm Mike Gatman. I'm the UK Account Director for ClearPoint and joined here today by Bain Hollister, our CEO. Thanks for joining us, Bain.
Most welcome. Awesome to be here.
Fantastic. So I really wanted us to get into a conversation around agentic AI engineering. We've talked a lot about it, and our engineering leads within our business have talked a lot about it as well, and the maturity cycle that we would see our engineers sort of take potentially over time, and how we support our clients on this journey as well. But stepping back from this, I'm just quite keen to now open up a conversation about what agentic AI engineering means for larger organizations. So let's take a macro view, maybe a macroeconomic view.
Yeah.
I recall something that you were telling me, which was, if you apply a kind of a lens around this, looking into, what would it take to be able to reduce a sprint, say, from around 2 weeks down to intraday. So within 1 day, you go from an idea into production, which I love the idea of. Mm-hmm. And we believe, agentic AI has the potential to do this, and we believe, it absolutely will. But, just sort of taking this notion forward as a silver thread, why do you think this is, an important lens to take a look through? And what would it mean for larger organizations more generally?
Yeah, great question. And I think as we go into this and unpack it, I think that, first of all, we're tremendously grateful to be living in this era of technology shift, global shift like this coming along into our industry, and to hold the role that we do as an engineering-centric professional services firm. We get to experience a lot of cross-sector, multi-sector change within that. And now we are, circa 3 to 4 years into the global platform shift, and there has already been so many major chapters, I suppose, along the way. Now, the lens of just looking at our established methodologies and really throwing up a mental challenge of what would need to be true to do something in 1 day is really a way to help just activate ourselves as leaders to think about, now that this technology is here and the sorts of things it can do, particularly with agentic engineering, what is no longer true, and what therefore is possible for teams to achieve. And it really is an interesting moment in the industry. Most large companies in the world have some sort of engineering capability somewhere in their organisation, and facing into that together as a global cohort, that's just a fascinating journey to be on. I think using the sprint analogy is useful because it's kind of become the way that the industry's worked for a couple of decades, and there's lots of really good reasons for that. But obviously it's predicated on the constraint being human labour and the amount of engineers and the amount of throughput we used to be able to get. And what's becoming super clear is that the tools break that relationship, the basic unit economics of producing code, I suppose, or producing systems. So what does that mean? How will we work? And what is all the scaffolding that sits around that going to look like? And that's a fun part for us to work together with clients and partners on.
Excellent. So if we take a step back and we take a look at, Agile as a kind of framework, as a sort of a way of delivering software, and it has been successful for 20 years or so now, where do we see some of the key constraints coming in to kind of riff on Goldrat's theory of constraints? What new constraints might agentic AI engineering engender, or what changes might come about?
It's really the fun part, isn't it? And let's celebrate the movement that Agile brought with it, and the digital movement as well globally kind of embraced the nature of business change and enabled us to work in a different kind of way, still constrained by, I guess, the human talent factor that was involved, but just helped us all globally look at work differently, as opposed to sort of earlier iterations of the tech industry being more structured and maybe waterfall.
That's
I think
right.
is the word that was used. But rolling forward today, I and others, that when we discuss the future, start to think about there's probably constraints here that are not yet come into view. The obvious ones, I suppose, is that when parts of the process speed up to the degree that don't really take any time at all, how does methodology support that? And how do the roles in the team support that? And how does the overall program support that? A lot of these things are a lot more native and easier for startups and small firms and small teams, but in a large enterprise, there's a fair amount of process in place normally for a very good reason. There might be some constraints there from a regulatory perspective, lots and lots of security focus. All of those things are true and need to be in place. However, our speed of delivery can change dramatically. So what does that mean for how we do those things?
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose taking a step back, looking at kind of what Agile was very good at, it was really good at sort of creating a measurable throughput for a given team, which meant, typically you had quite a large funnel upstream where the product owners, say, sort of liaising with the business, defining requirements, but there was always too much in the backlog for a team to actually get through. Typically, now with AI, you can, the feature development and the pace of delivery could be expected to increase. But throughput may not necessarily increase, as you point out, because actually there can be other factors, particularly around governance, I suppose, sort of architectural decision-making that still needs to happen. Anything to do, change boards, that sort of thing, that need to approve deployments. Some of those things are not necessarily evolving at the same sort of pace as the ability to be able to code using AI as well. And I know from talking to some of our engineers too, code review becomes a bit of a constraint as well. So even within the team, there's so much output from a given engineer that when another engineer comes to review the code, say, or review a pull request, they can take time, right? So yeah, it's interesting, and I think we'll see probably more and more tools actually emerging that will start to kind of attack some of those constraints too.
Yeah, and everything's moving forward at such an incredible pace at the same time. There's lots of different angles and layers to look through. One area, and I know you've done a lot of agile work over the years, Mike, and run a lot of teams. One area that I'm fascinated with is how do you go about sizing something in what is more maybe of a traditional enterprise environment? And a lot of the clients we work with and some of the projects that we do ourselves, we will use the traditional methods of squads and teams and features and epics and pulling all those things together, maybe doing some feature-driven type estimation. And as we steer into the future, maybe more a couple of horizons out, how does a CIO at a relatively large business start to think about how he or she sizes their work and therefore what's needed? I think there's a whole lot of interesting things to unpack underneath that.
That's right. And I think, will depend on the sort of the nature of the work too, but the ability to get moving more quickly, to move into build more quickly, rather than spending a lot of time sort of refining requirements and estimating, determining cost, probably changes the nature of the game. In fact, you could probably determine ultimately what it will cost to actually rebuild something using agents more quickly, because you can actually you can kick off work earlier, determine actually how you're going to do it using agents to then scope out the complete piece of work. I think we sort of take a look at legacy modernization, for example, as well, the potential for agents to essentially reverse engineer large legacy platforms, determine kind of core functionality, even dig into stored procedures is incredible. It's incredible how quickly you can actually pull together and document, and then define a well-architected solution, future solution, using agents as well. And so you can use these tools in order to really determine, okay, what's the best way to build it? How could we phase the work? And what sorts of teams would we need? And what's the shape of those teams in future? So
it's a huge
plenty
unlock.
Of potential.
Yeah, it's a huge unlock actually. And it doesn't take a lot to think of and imagine many, many clients and organizations who have landscapes of technology with areas of legacy in it, which from an investment perspective historically are just really quite a lot to go after, and therefore have been put on the back burner and maybe addressed from a risk perspective. But this unlock of a small team with the most incredible analytical tools, as you just described, to go after some of those systems and simplify, well-architected things that you're just talking about there, reduce risk, and be able to, more importantly, operate those things going forward, potentially under an agentic model or automated assisted AI model, is absolutely massive. It's huge. It's a risk reduction, and it's also talks to being able to do a lot more work with the same level of teaming.
Absolutely. So it's interesting you raised the point around the same level of team, but how might teams evolve over time too?
Yeah.
The size of the team, working with agents, how might that change? What are your thoughts?
Well, there's a lot there too. I mean, if we start at the kind of horizon one, and it makes a lot of sense and it's logical that there's a narrative out there that due to the impact of the technology, particularly at a per unit engineer level, there's lots of numbers sort of floating around, but 30%, 40% more productive. And it's natural for some leaders to make a calculation on cost saving in that way. I think very quickly, and it's happening for us right now, is leadership starting to think about the upside of all of that, because the reality is that pretty much all organisations that we've ever dealt with have far more demand than they have supply in terms of engineering work to do.
Absolutely.
And so being able to use the same level of team, ultimately we'll talk about how that teaming might change as we're all trying to figure out in this journey, but using the same level of team to go after 50% more work, 100% more work, 200% more work, because we're all sitting on the same tools and just watching those evolve, and the power that they're bringing through, either for unlock of legacy, but also for the development of new features for customers, is just incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing, which we're very focused on ourselves is how roles could change over time too. And I think some of the engineering positions we're looking to fill, actually, we are looking for a more kind of balanced set of experience across a range of different languages and specialisms too. So, we probably would start to expect engineers should be able to work across front end and back end languages. So be, with a little bit of React, amplified through an agent that does some front end coding, as well as using agents to build infrastructure. We could actually start to see engineers who used to be a bit more specialized start to become a bit more generalized. Which is one way it could go, but it will be interesting to see if new specialisms start to creep in as well.
100%. And I also think that there's a wonderful opportunity in the industry for the surfacing of all the things that engineers and technical staff were doing apart from some of the coding and heavy lifting of actual hands-on work.
Yes.
To become visible. And I think part of our role actually as leaders in the industry is to advocate for those other tasks that the engineering cohorts were doing, and they're really important. And a lot of them are humanistic things. I mean, understanding how to develop a product experience and how humans interact with digital technology, and how those visions sort of find their way into build processes using methodologies, as we've already discussed, might all start to change and morph over time. But we still need people who understand systems design and systems thinking and product design to be in those conversations. And we've got a long way to travel together globally as an industry, but it's fascinating journey to be part of. So just dwelling on Agile for a moment, Mike, and if we think about the ceremonies and processes that are observed typically within teams, and stand-ups and retros and demos and increment planning, all those sorts of things, are really designed to optimize the backlog of work and groom it and get it ready to go to optimize the throughput through the team. And now that some of the constraints are lifted around the speed of which code and systems can be produced, particularly with an agentic model, how might some of those ceremonies and things change?
Yes, well, it's a great question. I also think it could well change by virtue of the fact that the team itself is smaller. There are fewer humans in the team, fewer engineers, and maybe more of a convergence of responsibilities, which would probably reduce the size of the team. If you think about agile practices like the three amigos, for example, as being a really effective way of understanding requirements and determining how you build it and what tests you need to build to set up and ensure the quality is in there, you could have a team of three who are always the three amigos. And what they're doing is they're orchestrating a range of agents in order to be able to build and test the software. So it's quite an interesting paradigm. You can imagine many of these ceremonies will disappear over time, and I guess part of the issue as it was that they became just something teams did for. There's been a tendency for some of these ceremonies to become ceremonies for their own sake, where 100%. They don't necessarily add the value that they should have done or initially conceived to have to deliver on. And so why would you need them? Well, why would you need a daily stand-up, or why would you need sort of pre-planning those types of sessions when actually the teams are always working well? They're working closely together, the team members. They're working closely with the agents. There's full visibility of the pipeline of work coming through and visibility of where the work is in a given pipeline and how close it is to production. So I think the need for these types of routines will start to drop off. But it doesn't take away the need for close human connection throughout the process. I think that will still be needed more and more, actually. It raises some interesting thinking about how teams are actually set up and how close they should be to the business that they support, too. Because you can actually imagine, rather than sort of a divide or a distinction between your business and technology, everything becomes much more converged. And actually, the business and tech are just one thing. And to the point where having everyone essentially in one room, present in the same time zone, so that you can enable that sort of the speed of communication, decision making, becomes actually more and more necessary. So, Yeah, I can foresee a change in that respect as well, where there's probably less and less kind of, or certainly sort of a change in the way kind of work may have been sort of passed off to technology teams and maybe to an outsourced team, to something that's much more integrated and tightly sort of aligned with what the needs of the business are. Indeed, the business become more engineering focused themselves.
Fascinating. A lot of things to unpack in there. And first up in there is another mental framing we often reach for is it 2 teams of 6 or 6 teams of 2? And again, that's potentially a little bit out there extreme thing to throw up, but it's trying as a forcing function to get people to think about how things will be differently, just as you started to work through there. And a lot of interesting things happening further up the curve in terms of product management, product owners, and the tools that they're able to access, the way that they're able to sort of bring their ideas to light very early on in the cycle. And some of the best product managers that we know here, but in the UK, but also across the world, are actually hands-on a lot more with the tooling. And plugging those folks directly into the leading lights of principal engineers who can run many, many agents means, as you've just described, we can produce a huge amount all in one day, which tightens the cycle around decision-making and governance. And the thing that there's lots of things that are interesting within the cycle, because there are still lots of disciplines that are very important, particularly as they pertain to security and reliability and all of those service things that we've come to expect from our digital experiences. And none of that's going to go away. Potentially, as the maturity of the tooling comes through, it will make things a lot more reliable and hopefully secure. We're seeing a lot of action in that space with Anthropic and Glasswing and those sorts of announcements. But as the way teams work and companies work, we're going to have to accommodate much faster cycles, basically, is what you were saying.
Exactly. Yeah.
So to an extent, we've been through some changes like this before. I know you're across maybe nearly a decade ago, the changes around CI/CD and containerization and all the benefits that brought to teams. Are there some things that we can borrow, I suppose, from some of those changes that came through the industry back in the day?
Yeah, so I think if you think about CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment, it's quite analogous, but I think we're looking at something that's much more condensed now, aren't we? So I think there's many of the principles apply. With that, there was a real focus on test automation particularly. And I think back to the point around certain procedures and practices are still needed. Quality, of course, and quality engineering is a key part of the software delivery lifecycle too. So, how would we actually use agents to check the output of other agents to ensure that quality is being built into the solution that we're defining and building? But then how do you ensure that the right human oversight is also applied there as well, as you would with a CI/CD pipeline? So I think it's analogous, but I think the cycle time is greatly reduced. But because of that, the checks and balances and the human in the loops of interactions need to be very tight and on point with the right level of logging, monitoring in place as well.
The human in the loop part of the framing is interesting as well. As we start to think about, I think there's some narrative out there around the jagged edge of artificial intelligence as it comes into these domains like software engineering. There are some parts of that edge where it is clearly superior to what humans can do in those particular tasks. And then other areas where, humans in the loop are still absolutely critical. And understanding where we interface with technology through the life cycle is an ongoing journey for all of us globally. And as the tools mature and become more powerful, that line changes all the time.
That's right.
I was just thinking where we go with that. So just coming back to teams for a moment, one of the interesting aspects of the shift that's happening that we see and advocate for is first of all understanding what good performance is prior to the adoption of the technology. So in other words, helping clients understand throughput and performance of their existing engineering function and what areas to therefore go after from an adoption perspective. Again, looking historically, we've got a really solid foundation of Agile globally. The framing we use to activate clients' minds is, T-shirt sizing. and finding ways using Fibonacci or whoever to kind of roughly size things as they feed in. Again, that's kind of optimized for people-based teams. The way that teams might work and size and face into that work in the future is going to be really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the metrics themselves may evolve, but actually many of them I believe will still hold true. And we're proud advocates of the DORA metrics, for example, so change frequency, change failure rate, lead time to change. They're relevant metrics in this agentic world as well, because it is looking at sort of throughput and team performance. But importantly, these are some measures that have been correlated very closely with other business and operational performance measures as well. So yeah, it will be interesting to see how they might morph over time. They may evolve into something else that becomes more valuable. But I would say for now, DORA and, say, the EBO metrics, engineering excellence to business outcomes, will still be relevant because they do provide that baseline. For any CTO about to embark on this journey, and indeed, to try and sort of build the case such that you can present it to a CFO and try and cost it up, establishing a baseline is going to be really important. So really looking at how your teams perform in terms of the way in which they deploy code into production, the way in which they can respond to failures, the relevant metrics in this future world as well, and probably even more so. It becomes, almost inexcusable not to have a means to kind of measure these things effectively as a means of measuring performance. I think, gone will be the notion of measures like story points, which never really measured anything anyway. So, it's not an accurate measure of performance at all for a software engineering team. So I think that could be kind of comfortably scrapped because you wouldn't be story pointing anything anyway in the first place.
Yeah.
And once you have that baseline, then you can actually enable a plan for how you start to roll out your agents as well. So where do you actually start? Where do you see potentially the greatest need for an improvement, or are there challenges in terms of the quality, the number of bugs being deployed into production? What might you need to do to ensure that you're able to kind of build and monitor the performance of the tests that you have in place? So I see the agents can certainly accelerate all of that activity, but you can really target it and pinpoint it into where the value is, where the performance value is, which I think is necessary too. Because conversely, you don't want to try and boil the ocean with this as well, because you would lose control. You still want to maintain control of your software delivery lifecycle end to end, and you need to understand the impact of every change that you're making. None of that has really sort of changed, but the tools that you have now available as a team are much more, extensive. But so is the risk too. I think something that we like to consider and something we talk to our clients about is the amplification effect. So any poor practices, or for example, the fact if you're frequently deploying production or bugs into production, and you spend a lot of your time trying to resolve these, then actually you need to ensure that you're not amplifying that through just generating more code. Say you would need to focus on your tests. So being aware of the amplification effects of AI agents is also going to be important, so that you can build them in the right place, you can inject them into the right position, the right point in your SDLC to get the right level of value, and you can measure the performance improvement over time, or indeed determine where there may be some degradation in your performance as well.
Yeah, it's a range of really good points there, Mike, and I think that across that spectrum we probably are likely to expect different types of performance measurement to come through for the enterprise. I mean, DORA is an awesome foundation for that. We've always loved it. And just looking at rates of change and change failure, when you see those things really scoring well on a benchmark, you know that a lot of the other things in an environment must be true, particularly as it relates to automation and even reaching as far back as CI and CD as well. So I think there's going to be similar measures coming into the frame. But there's just so many other changes that organisations are going to, let's put it out there, are going to be confronted with through this amplification process. As an engineering-centric professional services company, we focus in on the technology and all of the optimizations that are happening there, and then the engineer themselves and the team and the performance. What quickly comes into frame is dependencies between teams and systems and highly complex environments in large enterprises. You can look at environments and structures and people and systems and draw parallels with Conway's law around how systems have evolved over time. Those constraints, when the timing collapses for delivery of code, become very visible, because the ability of a team to release or deliver a particular feature for a customer may be dependent on other parts of the system. It could be dependent on other international dependencies, not just other teams and people, but there might be constraints that need to be unlocked in core APIs or what have you. It really throws a lot up in the air to maximise the benefits of agentic AI. There's some pretty serious reconfiguration that might need to happen under the hood in terms of the technology landscape that clients have.
Yeah, that is a fascinating point. And I suppose potentially the fact that these agents can expose shortcomings and limitations and constraints across the organization might lead executives to even sort of believe that there are faults with the agents themselves or the changes in
sort of a
process.
misdiagnosis. Yeah.
Misdiagnosis, precisely.
Because it seems that, and particularly in these early stages, what we're finding in some of our work with clients is that those constraints were already there, but somewhat masked by the current throughput.
Yes, exactly.
Even if it's weekly or daily release trains, then that's still slow enough that there can be dependencies hidden under the hood that would disable you from going any faster than that.
Yes.
And this amplification process is throwing those up. And what's fascinating about that is, and a journey that we must all go on together, is that a lot of those things might be beyond the purview of the CIO to be able to change and alter. They could be structural things, they could be contractual things, there could be all sorts of constraints and environments, to your earlier point, which will only come as we apply the technology and speed up. So another hot topic of conversation is when we look at our team makeups and just thinking as a thought experiment, maybe a team of 6, there's maybe 3 engineers in there, there's a quality person, there's maybe a product, a typical makeup of a squad, then what that might look like in the future, not just in terms of the number of people, but how the roles might actually change.
Yes. I think something that we're starting to see more of is that convergence of product and engineering, and you could well imagine actually an engineer is quite a sort of strong level of commercial context and awareness, and is quite readily able to then create a specification for the system that they're actually building and take that through into a solution design and define the architecture for it. So that may change. Another kind of spin on that might be that a product owner with access to the right tools is able to now rapidly prototype, even vibe code an idea. So moving away from the writing of user stories, say, and actually generating something that a team can understand and well describes the business context such that you can then develop the full solution from it. So that's a pattern of behavior that's already started, but I think it's likely that these two roles will get closer and closer. Quality engineering, I think that may still be a specialism. It's one of those areas that even as test automation came in and test-driven development, of course, developers can write their own tests, but having someone with a really good quality mindset who can really look at everything from the design through to how every single story and acceptance criteria is being kind of delivered against, you still need that thinking within the team, and you still again need that level of oversight to determine that what the agents are actually building is actually of a suitable standard of quality. That could well be kind of an area that sort of is still an area of specialism, and personally I would like to see that. So that's one thing. Platform engineering and infrastructure, that could well be a specialism that's retained, or maybe that ends up sort of melding further with software engineers too. Becomes easier and easier to spin up new environments, infrastructure as code. So maybe you don't need a specialist role within a team or within a technology organization. But I would say for some time you likely will. I can't see that going away anytime soon.
A colleague in the industry said to me recently, he said, what, Bain, I think this moment with the global platform shift, finally our industry will become a proper creative industry. And I'm like, whoa, that was an interesting thing to say and to unpack. And this particular individual said, well, we've been on a side journey for 30 or 40 years doing all the technical things that needed to be done.
Okay, yes.
And now there's a level of abstraction here where we can stand back and become back into the creative space that we live in. There are certain subcategories of technology, I know globally, which have always been more leaning in the creative direction. And I think that as we travel into the future, some of those, it will be a long tail, and there will be some disciplines that are going to be required for quite a lot longer yet. What do you think about that as a future for the industry?
Well, I think it sort of touches on the points I was making earlier, where you can just see this sort of convergence of like business and tech. They're not really separate functions, and the whole organization becomes quite a creative and fast-moving beast that can iterate really quickly. If you can counter some of the constraints to sort of pushing ideas out the door, the moving idea to production within a day or even less, within an hour, and in a kind of a testable and measurable way, becomes more and more feasible. And it brings more and more of the organization, and it really helps to kind of uplift the level of kind of creativity and ideation capable that's possible. So I think another role, actually, which we haven't really touched on, is that of user experience and design thinking as well. And I think this is actually, another critical element of a team. And I think more and more, I was actually having a chat the other day with someone around, the build of agentic workflows, for example, agentic AI workflows, and the role of user experience designers within that too. Now, that's quite interesting, because it's like, well, how do you ensure that there are the right checkpoints and the human in the loop interactions with the outputs to ensure that you're actually getting the best result at the end of it too. And I can imagine the discipline of service design, for instance, becoming a bit more integrated and sitting across sort of the way agents are actually working to deliver some output as well. Even
from an engineering experience perspective.
From an engineer, yeah, and I think absolutely. I think that's absolutely critical. And I think it can even be, how you go about designing an API should actually have a level of experience design oversight too, because that's integrated with the client. There's some interaction with that. There's an input and output, some data's returned, that sort of thing. It's presented in some way, and it's got to be workable for an engineering team, and it's got to be workable by the agents. So for me, that speaks of design thinking. I'm not a designer myself, but I love the discipline that it brings into ensuring that wherever humans are involved, the experience is uplifted and optimized as much as possible.
It does seem like a space calling out for that discipline, for sure. So how do we create projects and environments where engineers and agents can do their best work together?
That's right.
And that's very different to how things have operated historically.
That's right.
Using that as a guiding tenet towards how organisations evolve might be a useful way to sort of face into the future, because there's so many things changing all at once. There's so many orthogonal angles to where AI can be applied and how we experience it through our digital tooling, that it makes it difficult to move from a transition perspective or a transformation perspective from point A to point B when we're not really too sure what point B looks like. So we're finding ways to have a North Star and guide ourselves towards the next stage in the journey is really important.
So Bain, just to tie it back to the silver thread, the intraday sprint that kicked off this conversation, and why agentic AI engineering, what the impact of that is from an organizational perspective as well. As a leader yourself in the C-suite, why should you care, and what should you consider next?
Yes, and with so many things yet to unfold, and our colleagues and friends who are CIO or CTOs, we have a huge amount of respect and empathy for, particularly those who lead in quite large organisations, dozens, maybe even more squads, global operations, outsourced teams, highly complex legacy environments, reasonably complicated budgeting and investment cycles per year in various different domains. And just knowing where to start is really tough, because it is not quite like any other technological platform shift that we've had before. It looks like that it is going to be a collaboration across the C-suite. So we're doing our best to advocate for the other colleagues, CFO, CEO, to understand and manifest up the future a bit about what's possible, and help them move beyond Horizon 1 thinking of, the impact of uplift of, 30% of coding time or what have you, and just
Yes.
some more unbounded thinking about what's possible, particularly in those environments where, and it's lived experience. They know that there's way more demand per year than they're able to invest in and address, not to mention legacy modernisation work. So collaborating together and sort of starting to pick apart their own capability, it's a capability shift. And as humans, we get pretty enamoured with the magic of the tooling, and particularly as it keeps changing and evolving in front of our eyes almost. But really looking back and abstracting back a bit and thinking about what is our capability actually going to look like and what's possible. I mean, any business that you could engage with at a senior level to say, hey, you could do twice as much, 3 times as much of this particular thing with the same level of people, or same level of investment, I should say, is, that's a really interesting conversation to unpack. And it's complicated because we don't know what the future operating model necessarily is. We've got some really good ideas about it, and maybe there's a few iterations to go through to meet that. It has a sense of inevitability about it that we need to go on that journey, though, in all different domains.
So, and I think, where we come in as ClearPoint, as a trusted partner to a large number of firms and some significant, some quite large ones, is, we are there to support that journey. We're launching what we call the A3 playbook, which you can find out more on our website. But this is all about really assessing and measuring where our clients' engineering teams are now and their engineering organization. And looking through the standard lenses of people, ways of working and technology, really sort of looking at the cultural aspects as well. Applying the right measures, whether those are EBO or sort of DORA sort of measures to understand the baseline, and then determining how we can support them through that journey. And we've actually now created a range of agents that can actually perform some of the checks, and we can actually, quite rapidly determine maybe where some of the pain points are now. It could be within a given workflow within the SDLC. It could be in the way that teams are working together, so that we can actually, try and identify constraints and hopefully then break those down. But it is a journey. It's absolutely a journey for all of us too. And some of the tools and the frameworks that we have developed and have used very successfully over the years need to constantly evolve. We cannot stay still on any of this.
Yeah, I mean, and we consciously designed the A3 model to take that into account, taking the best of practices that we've known over many decades now, with a spirit of being able to move and learn very quickly and adopt quickly and be open to those things that you mentioned around culture and process and teams as well as technology, to try and really accelerate the rate of diffusion of the technology into teams. And it's a very powerful way of identifying those things, almost with an amplification lens, and going after them. And a lot of those things may not be technological in their nature.
9 times out of 10 they aren't. And if we can, through the use of these tools, and shine a light on where some of those constraints are early, and support our clients in building a business case, being able to identify what the investment would be to move forward, then that's great. It's a great partnership to be involved in, because we can recognize how when you start to bubble up these improvements, the greater organizational impacts, the productivity improvements that you can see, actual, even improvements to the bottom line become quite evident and very measurable, and something that can, be presented to the board and have a clear decision made against them. So,
indeed, yeah. So for our C-level colleagues globally and the change that they're facing into, what are our initial ideas at this point in the journey about how they could go after that change? And I ask that from the perspective of there are lots of norms and conventions that leaders use to assemble their technology capability today, which might not necessarily be the same going forward. Thinking about, a CIO at a large firm who's under instruction, I suppose, or guidance to adopt AI broadly in their teams, starting points to go about doing that.
I think, again, just really taking a look at sort of how teams are sort of operating today, because, you don't want to take on too much. I think you want to be able to demonstrate, the performance improvements and the value that they're getting from any agents that they're embedding. You don't want to dilute that impact. you also want to avoid amplification of any poor practices or any underlying kind of dependencies that may be problematic as well. So I think, starting small, as with many things really, I think and measure and learn is going to be the most effective way of being able to kind of radiate upwards the improvements and what's been learned along the way, so that you can help to bolster a strategy.
Yes, and helping, I guess it's a float all boats and learn together type situation for staff as well. I mean, we find ourselves in a rapid learning cycle as technologists, and another framing we reach for sometimes is learn one, see one, do one, so that we mix teams up with experienced practitioners who are sort of further up the curve with agentic technology than others, and help everybody kind of learn together. I think more broadly, it's a really interesting roadmap ahead for C-level folks. I think creating space for transformation is going to be quite important. Figuring out how to lead through this change is going to be an interesting space. There's a lot of work going in there, and it's still an evolving space. And then understanding, as we've talked about, the areas of impact where the technology will really give you a greater uplift, and leaving that opportunity for the unforeseen friction to emerge in other areas, but also the new roles and the new disciplines that might come out of the amplification process from AI.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think the wrong way to go about doing it would be to sort of do an upfront transformation plan, determine your new org structure, and then this is now how we're going to operate. I think, grassroots is going to be more effective, and everyone needs to learn together, so that actually, between teams, the tools can be built for various teams to use and to experience the benefits from. But the results are then shared upwards and then used to help to define and then redefine the strategy over time. It's, as you say, all boats rise together. It's a learning cycle, rapid cycles through to slightly longer cycles, but with the mandate and the direction and the oversight from the C-suite. So very exciting time for them, but it raises a lot of questions and
a lot of work to do.
No doubt.
It's not just here's your AI, go faster.
Absolutely. You're amplifying the wrong thing, you may end up going much slower than you were previously as well. So I think everyone needs to be aware of that, across the C-suite, and like you mentioned, CFO looking for a 30% cost reduction. Well, that's not just by applying agents everywhere, that's by taking quite a measured approach and learning kind of gradually as we go and looking for the big wins once they've proven themselves.
100%. So Mike, starting to summarise things up, if we're sitting with a colleague, CIO, CTO today, and we're to give them some starting advice on how to get going on their AI journey, and perhaps setting aside a lot of the things that we know that are constraints already, what sort of things do you think would spring to mind for you to give them guidance?
I would start from the grassroots and really look at how teams are operating today and performing, and actually ultimately delivering value back to the business. I think that's important, because otherwise it's very hard to sort of set the course and determine which way you go. So I think I would want to see the establishment of actually very effective practices at the ground level that then demonstrate real value being returned back to the business, that the CTO then can clearly point at, and then that can hopefully then unlock further funding, further investment to then go broader. Well, what do you think about that, Bain? What if you were to think about the most important thing and the right place to start?
Yeah, the most important, that's kind of tricky because there are so many aspects to it. I think that if we're sitting here with a colleague, CTO, client, benchmarking where you are today is really important, and being able to demonstrate a sense of progress to your peers and to your stakeholders. And then understanding which levels of abstraction really matter, that it's more of a best of breed style, not solved situation than going out and looking for a single answer. And to us, that often means leaning in towards human capital, actually, learning together, staying up to date, seeing the direction of travel is with a lot of these things for your engineering teams, and finding a really good partner who potentially has multi-sector experience and can see where things are going to splice in with your team and give you that uplift in engineering capability. The challenging parts will be there might be some really key things that have to change within your environment, which might involve talking to your other C-level colleagues about, and getting a degree of conviction and investment around some of those changes to really unleash the power of the technology that people can use. So an open mind and a journey-based kind of mindset, I think, is really important as well.
Everyone taking the journey together
100%.
and learning as they progress. And the importance of partnership as well, learning from others, best of breed, where are they now in their journey, is naturally a critical angle to take.
100%. And look, I think if we cast our eyes to the future and start to think about the future of work in our industry and those sorts of things, what's starting to become clearer as we get into the journey is there is a huge amount of work that needs to be done. And you might hear from some of the leaders of the large global firms internationally talking about the rate of diffusion. And when you imagine the number of companies in the world, the number of industries and businesses, and the degree to which they already rely on technology and the journey that they must go through, then there's huge amounts for engineers to do. And it's easy to imagine that we actually might need a larger workforce than currently exists globally to go after all of the things that we want to be able to do, notwithstanding the power of the AI technology now that we have at our disposal. So from our point of view, I suppose, from a ClearPoint's perspective, it's an extremely optimistic future, and we're going to be unlocking things that weren't possible before, and there is going to be, yes, a lot of change, but quite an enormous amount of benefit that flows from that.
Fantastic. Well, there's a great and a very positive note to end on. So, thanks for your time today, Bain. It's been a fantastic conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Likewise. Thank you, Mike.